Kieran, starting from the beginning, today's workshop, it's about go-to-market and growing your product. For people who don't know you, can you just give us a quick intro about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me on, Arthur. So my name is Kieran. I've been working in B2B sales now for the last 6 or 7 years. More specifically, over the last 2 or 3 years, been running a fractional GTM service specifically for B2B tech and SaaS, born out of the pain that I think I experienced as a B2B sales leader, which is founders don't want to hire too soon. Sales hires can be very expensive. You can't scale that early if you don't hire. So trying to manufacture that intersection between lead gen, demand gen, and RevOps is the way I like to position myself. So that's a little bit about me. Hopefully, it gives you context as to why Arthur's invited me on. And keen to get stuck into all things GTM.
Early days with the launch of their product, and they try to get some eyeballs from potential buyers in a B2B space for their product. Like if you were to launch a new product, you have this beautifully packaged software with a beautiful website. Like, how do you bring customers? How would you bring customers if you were just to launch a new product?
Sure. So I think the first thing I always recommend to any startup trying to launch something new features, new service, whatever that might be, is be very, very clear on who exactly it is that you're selling to. Now, what I don't mean by that is you have a firmographic visual of what your ideal customers might look like, i.e., 100 to 500 people in headcount. They work in X industries with Y regulations, for instance. I'm talking about getting very specific on a person level to what it is they experience in their day to day that is physically painful a lot of the time. So rather than applying the broad stroke brush to lots of different companies, think about exactly one specific vertical that you can solve for straight away. Because one thing that I regularly see founders fall into the trap of is they build a product that they think is valuable and it can service, say,
Mm.
between 3 and 5 different industries. But unless you're really, really clear on exactly what industry that is, who the ICP is, and why they should care, you effectively create a message and a position which resonates with nobody because you're trying to resonate with everybody. And so that's the long-winded version. So I think the short version of that is being really, really clear on exactly who it is that you're targeting and why that is, and being very disciplined with yourself on that. Because I think for lots of founders, you build a great
Mm.
product and you have a great marketing message and whatever it might be.
Mm.
But fundamentally, if you're targeting the wrong people at the very first instance, you're just burning bridges faster than you can operate effectively. Targeting and being really clear on your ICP is the very, very first step. And it's never what's the cheesy line? It's a journey, not a destination. It's kind of that with your ICP is it's never done. It's you're constantly iterating on top of it. So that was my first point is being really clear on your ideal customers and why they should care about your product or service. And then the second thing is something that I call watering holes. So there's a famous, I say famous, it's somewhat famous framework based out of MIT. There's an entrepreneur
Mm.
called, his name escapes, Bill Owler, and he coined this framework called the Disciplined Entrepreneurship Canvas. And what the deck is, DEC deck, is effectively a 1 to 24 step matrix on how to build a software business and all the things that you should care about. And it's iterative, and he gets you to think about it in a way that is a cycle rather than a one and done type motion. And a big part of that is watering holes. And by watering holes, it's effectively where do your ideal customers spend their time. For me, for instance, I work exclusively with startups and B2B tech. So my ICP lives and breathes on LinkedIn. So that's my watering hole. So being clear on who you're targeting, why that is, the value you can provide. And the next step to that is where are they spending their digital time? And that's how you can focus the demand generation piece to really tap into, I suppose, that activity that they're using day to day.
So for most of people listening to us today, LinkedIn is the main platform to acquire customers, build those relationships, and people just are not, like, in most cases, great with LinkedIn. It's hard to stay consistent and, know what to write about. And LinkedIn posting is just like a one field of many. So you need to do posting, you need to do direct message outreach, maybe some ads, and there are like maybe newsletter, or maybe there are like even different channels outside of LinkedIn going like multi-platform. If you were like early days, what do you believe are the strongest, biggest levers people can pull to get the first, let's say, 10, 20, 50 customers?
My recommendation always start with LinkedIn. And the reason for that is more, I'd say, since the beginning of 2025, LinkedIn has pretty much become the leading platform for B2B sales. And I think a large part of the reason for that is LinkedIn limited third-party tools' ability to tap into their data and their APIs, etc. So now things like Sales Navigator, LinkedIn's leads database, is pretty much the gold standard when it comes to lead generation data. The B2B databases, Sales Nav is the gold standard, in my opinion. So I think LinkedIn is always has to be at the very forefront of it, because there's two ways to contact your buyers on LinkedIn. You can do it passively, i.e. they scroll through content just through their lunch break, when they're walking through the street, whatever that might be, sat on a bus if you like. And that's passive content that they can passively consume over time, and you build that trust at scale over time. But then to your point, Arthur, about the other ways that you can leverage that as well, things like DMs, ads, newsletter, data capture, all those kinds of things. LinkedIn still remains the only place in B2B tech, or B2B broadly, where you can do all of that, both intentionally and passively, all inside one platform. So in terms of the quick wins, I would say LinkedIn is 100% my recommendation. Because the other side to that as well is it still remains, I think, the only channel whereby organic reach can still trump paid reach a lot of the time. So if you were to look at Reddit ads or Meta ads or even Google ads, it is very much a pay to play arena. You're not going to win unless you put lots of budget behind the thing that you're trying to achieve. LinkedIn is very different. You can have a very organic reach coming from a human rather than a robot or an automated system. And for that reason, it builds trust at scale faster than any other method of content does. So there's lots of elements to it. There's lots of levers you can pull. But LinkedIn would always be my recommendation to start, because it's the easiest way to prove that traction quickly. I think cold email has been pretty much, I mean, cold email still has a purpose. Of course it does. And depending on the volume of campaign that you're trying to run, cold email can still be a valid route to go down. But for the earliest stage, unless you have the sophistication of 200 different inboxes to rotate and lots of different domains to rotate, it can become very painful very quickly. Whereas with LinkedIn, you don't necessarily have those barriers to entry. So LinkedIn is absolutely the kind of foundation of it all. And I think more recently, what I've been experimenting with and my clients are leveraging quite heavily is Reddit. And I think that the reason for that, and you have to be very specific about the forums you find in Reddit that are specific to your context and your use case and your ICP. But what I find with Reddit more recently, especially over the last 2 years, is that people are very unfiltered about what they think on Reddit. Whereas if you are to post content on LinkedIn, for instance, there's a filter because it's your professional filter. You can't say, what are you talking about, you numpty, right? Because you have your professional background attached to that. But with Reddit, people are a lot more, what's the word? I suppose willing to kind of throw stones at you a little bit, which is a good and a bad thing at the early stage. But I think there's no better way to kind of be grounded in reality than the feedback of Reddit. So I think they're the two avenues that I would always recommend at the earliest stage, and then layer in the more complex kind of platforms and channels like cold calling, cold emailing, events if you have budget to. Later on, once you know that certain angle of message or your certain position that you've carved out via LinkedIn, once you know that's resonating, that's when it's time to layer in the other channels. And you can begin that multi-channel campaign that I guess is the gold standard and the goal for most companies. But at the early stage, onboarding those early users, LinkedIn is definitely the forefront.
And when you run campaigns, how many LinkedIn accounts, like a business would need to run an effective campaign? Is that just one account of the founder, or maybe we need to use multiple accounts of a team? Like, how does it work?
Both. Kind of both. Okay, and I'll walk you through why that is. To give you context, 3 of my clients at the moment, we are only running LinkedIn outreach from one account only. I've got a client starting in a couple of weeks where we'll be running 6 accounts. But they are very different stages. So the companies that I just mentioned we are running one LinkedIn account, they are seed stage, approaching a Series A round, whereby they're kind of relying on founder-led sales, which, they don't want to hire a salesperson at this stage. And founder-led sales is doing well for their trust and their credibility at scale. So at the early stage, often if it's dialed in and you know exactly who you're targeting and why that is, often one account can be enough. But then talking about my other client at the moment who are going to leverage 6 accounts, they are a very mature company, almost at 2 million ARR, and they want to leverage 3 founder accounts and 3 sales team accounts, target very specific industry verticals. So they have a tool and technology that is broadly applicable to multiple verticals. And what they're trying to do with LinkedIn is make one founder the expert in X industry, another founder the expert in Y industry. So the role there is talk around pains and challenges for those specific industries, and the outreach goes to those specific industries. So that's a very long-winded way of saying it very much depends on the stage that you're at. You can get great success with one founder account. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you're trying to scale and you're testing multiple different markets because you've pretty much conquered your initial beachhead market, then you can layer in more founders or sales team, whatever that might look like. Ultimately, it depends on the stage you're at.
Great. And then a follow-up question to that is, when you manage those accounts, like I'm always worried, like giving to anyone access to my LinkedIn account, that LinkedIn might flag it and I might lose access to my very important asset. So how does it work when you work with someone, or like anyone on this call would to engage with any external like kind of LinkedIn management firm? Like how do you manage this posting, direct message outreach? Like how does it work?
Sure. So from an operational perspective, it's pretty straightforward for between me and my client. So I set up a shared Google Sheet with the content that is going to be written across the week, Monday through Friday usually, with the graphics or illustrations attached to those posts. The client would then manually schedule them themselves, because one thing that is frowned upon by LinkedIn's backend is if you automate that content scheduling at scale. You might have come across things like Buffer in the past.
Yeah.
That does limit your reach on LinkedIn if you were to use them, because it doesn't like third-party scheduling tools. So my clients will always schedule it natively within the platform. And then from an outreach perspective, I use a certain tool called Heyreach. I'm not sponsored by Heyreach, but that's just my tool of choice. And the way it works is you can configure the limits to sit comfortably within LinkedIn's limits. So you're allowed to send up to 600 connection requests a month before it's flagged as spam, which averages about 25 per day, roughly 40 messages per day. If you are to go above that limit, LinkedIn flags it as spam.
Okay, can I stop you there? It's quite interesting. So within Heyreach, so I guess within the sales navigator, before you like kind of identify a segment of businesses that like, yep, this profile should kind of connect with those businesses. And then within a Heyreach, you run automated invites with, I guess, some kind of placeholder message in there, right?
Exactly that. So you sequence it in a very similar way to you would with an email campaign. The cool thing is with tools like Heyreach or Prosp, or there's lots of them that exist, is you can automate how you interact with profiles as well. So for instance, if I wanted to connect with you, for instance, Arthur, and I've never met you before, via Heyreach, I can configure it so that I view your profile, I like your post, and then I send you a connection request. But I never actually have to do that manually. It does it all for me.
Okay. So that would be like, all right, I see. So that will be a sequence, like a warming up towards the connection.
Exactly that.
Would Heyreach as well do like AI comments on posts, or that's
no? So that's one thing that Heyreach doesn't do, and I think that's a good thing.
I agree.
There's we've all seen the AI bots on comments, right? That add no value and they just regurgitate what you've already said in the post. So no, Heyreach doesn't do that. I've seen some tools that do it. I've looked at them and I've thought, I've seen the standard of some of the comments, and yeah, it's not for me personally, but by all means give it a go if it's in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, makes sense. So I do like a lot of this Heyreach automations. I looked at the platform, looks super like slick, professional, and coming back to this connection request. So from your experience running those campaigns, what I'm hearing is liking someone posts, viewing the profile. What's the kind of time frame between those actions you would recommend?
Usually within 5 to 7 days. And the reason for that is you become top of mind, right? And that's the it's a bit of a buzzword, but it kind of is the crux of it as well, is that you remain in a prospect's mind. And with email campaigns, you kind of see it drip fed over time, and then eventually there's a call to action. The methodology for Heyreach and LinkedIn outreach is very similar, except you nurture them via profile views, liking posts, etc. The difficulty is with some campaigns is you can't always tell if somebody's viewed your profile, right? So I do use LinkedIn Premium, so I'm lucky to have that feature. But for prospects who don't necessarily have LinkedIn Premium, they're not going to know that you viewed the profile, because it'll just say somebody in X industry has viewed your profile. Whereas if you like the post as well, it's warming up to that, and you can kind of assume that this is somebody that's tried to contact you in that way. It's really effective. And I think one thing that I realized quite early on with LinkedIn outreach is unless you do that warming up of the prospect, the connection rates drastically drop. The sample that I ran last year was around a 15% difference. So I think campaigns that we were averaging 50% connection rates, roughly. Those campaigns were warming up the prospect via likes and profile views, and the ones that weren't were averaging around 30%. So it's just creating that familiarity over time. And if you're doing that with content as well at the same time, then it creates that familiarity and trust that scale even faster.
Brilliant, brilliant. I have a few follow-up questions. So this is like a very practical session, so we can share it in the form of like shorts or article or the full recording on YouTube. It's why I'm going quite deep on those questions rather than keeping it high level.
Awesome.
So one of the questions that I have in my mind, and some other people might have as well, is once within a Heyreach, you schedule these actions, warming up the individual to the relationship, and then you send a request, you put a text message. Like, from your experience, what works better, being direct, indirect, inviting to maybe some kind of warming up activity like event works better, or straight like, that's my thing, they want to buy it? Like, what works in your experience?
So it's a terrible answer, but all of the above. And the reason I say that is because it very much depends on the ICP. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So I'm working with a medtech client at the moment, and their target customer is medical directors, clinical leads, very serious people is the way I like to think about this, right? So people who are not necessarily prone to startup language, like, for want of a better word, the corporate speak. So in that sense, it's often professional communication that is needed, being very direct about things like ROI for that specific ICP. But then equally, I've run campaigns in the past where the initial message can be less than 100 characters long, and you just ask a binary question, and that gives very good responses. So I think it very much depends on how, I don't know, it's probably not the best word to use, but how serious your customers are. For instance, cybersecurity buyers, they are very they don't want to take on risk if you're a CISO or security manager, whatever that might be. So communicating in a way that makes sure that they feel it's professional and grounded in reality rather than hyperbole and marketing language is really important. One thing that I found has been really, really effective over the last 6 months in particular, I think, is once somebody engages with your content. So let's say, for instance, they like your post, they comment, or they view your profile, call out that signal directly. And what I mean by that is they are what I would call intent signals. So they're showing intent by engaging with content that is manufactured specifically for them. So if you're my ICP, for instance, and you like my post, I reach out to you directly because I know that what I've talked about resonates with you because you've engaged with that content. So you get prioritized into a sequence, and you can automatically do that via things like Jungler. There's a tool called Jungler. ClearQ is another one. And you effectively automate the outreach to make sure that the content that you've produced is resonating with a specific audience. And it's about creating that flywheel effect. So there is no silver bullets to this, is what I'm trying to say here, Arthur. There is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all message or format that works.
Yes.
It very much depends on your customers, but binary messages I've found more recently getting very high response rates, but don't necessarily drive towards meetings.
A few more questions that come to my mind. So we run this Heyreach campaign. We warm up the connection, then there is this connection request, someone viewing our profile. Maybe there are like some tools automating it, or we do it manually because there isn't that many views. What intrigued me last time we had a chat offline was running ads against those people. And how do you find and segment these audiences against whatever activity you run on LinkedIn? How does it work?
Do you mean as in how do we define which audience we want to target by ads?
Yeah, pretty much. Like I'm pretty new to LinkedIn ads, so that's...
Yeah, no, awesome. So I run what I would call micro campaigns, which is prospects. The list is never bigger than, say, 1,000 people. And the reason for that is you are able to get through the filters a lot quicker. And when it comes to LinkedIn ads, you can specifically target up to usually around 60% of that list via LinkedIn ads. So how that works...
Can you, within the LinkedIn ads, can you target each individual rather than category?
You can do both. There's two ways to do it. You've got the company level where you can advertise via specific roles. So you have a list of companies, for instance, and you want to target the regulation manager within those companies, for instance. And then the other way you do it is through match rates via uploading contact lists. So if I have a list of 1,000 prospects, for instance, on a person level, you can upload that list to LinkedIn's ads campaign manager through the specific format that it gives you, with a view to try and match that audience. Now, there's lots of back-end I suppose, ways that you need to engineer this to guarantee a higher match rate. The few that I use in particular are work email is the obvious one. Then URL is another one. Personal email and hashed email. Now, you can get these four things from tools like Freckle, which is a data enrichment platform. Clay is another example. And what you do by getting these domains and these URLs is effectively de-risking how likely it is that you won't get in front of that person. So again, after I use you as an example, you're on my list, for instance, and I want to advertise my services to you. And I would upload your LinkedIn URL, your personal email, if I could find it via enrichment, your work email, and your hashed email, all within that contact list via LinkedIn ads, so that I can almost guarantee that the ad that I'm pushing to that audience is going to be seen by you at least once, twice, three times, whatever I want. LinkedIn still remains the only platform in which you can do that, i.e. you've got a list of people you want to advertise to, and you do that with accuracy. What's really interesting about this space at the moment, and this has only happened in the last week, is Clay, who are probably the leading go-to-market platform for data, and have just released something called Clay Ads, and they are claiming that you can reach up to 90% match rates with their platform, meaning that you can effectively build the list within Clay, advertise via LinkedIn through Clay, and it will guarantee 90% of your audience sees your ad, which is completely unrivaled to anything you've ever seen before. So it's an interesting development. It's very much a bit of a grey area,
That's great,
but exciting at the same time.
Something that came to my mind with this, like it's almost like tactics territory here. So would you recommend running ads on specific accounts before running a connection or after? Like how do you go about it, or whether you at all kind of match those two things together, or they're just like independent?
So they do merge together, but I like to do what I call a testing period first. So there's kind of three core elements to how LinkedIn works, right? You've got content, outreach, and ads. And the idea is to create this whole flywheel / ecosystem around the three of them. But ads can be really expensive if you don't know what resonates with your audience to begin with. So the way that this works in practice is over, say, an 8 to 12 week period, we figure out, we being me and my clients, or if I was just to recommend this to the audience, for instance, go through an 8 to 12 week process of daily content, using LinkedIn content via your founder account, and outreach. And after 8 to 12 weeks, you have a decent enough sample size to understand what message resonates and why that might be. So at that point, it makes sense to switch on ads, because you're paying to scale, you're not paying to test. And my philosophy is never pay to test too early, because LinkedIn ad budgets can become very expensive very quickly if you're not careful. So to your point, Arthur, about how that kind of joins up then, I never recommend running things like form capture ads or data capture ads via LinkedIn, because most people, the data shows that they don't interact with them. The ads that I do tend to run are top of funnel boosted posts. So for instance, if I have a post that's performed very well for a particular topic, I will put some ad budget behind that and boost it, not because that post specifically is going to drive revenue, but it drives attention and it drives trust via profile views, via content engagement. And therefore I can prioritize those people, because those eyeballs I can guarantee are seeing my content time and time again. And that's what creates the flywheel. So once you understand what message resonates via the first two principles, content and outreach, you scale that to ads, and then you keep reiterating that time and time again through an 8 to 12 week process to refine what works, and you get closer and closer to message market fit, which I think in 2026 is arguably just as important as product market fit.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then in all of that, it's quite interesting. What's your take on sponsored posts? So let's say that someone is like, what's the word? Someone is just posting something nice about your business or like a relationship, and you sponsor that post. What's your experience with that?
It's a double-edged sword, because what it can do really well is build trust at scale very fast, because it's effectively a living, breathing testimonial that exists within LinkedIn that isn't from your team. So in that sense, it can be really, really powerful. But on the flip side is, if that person isn't a genuine customer or doesn't fit into your ICP bracket, for instance, you risk building reach in the wrong direction. Within LinkedIn, that's really important, because if you build too much reach into, let's say, for my context, if I was to build too much credibility and authority in the agency niche, I would have lots of agency founders and people like me interacting with my content, which I don't particularly want. Like, it's nice to kind of have that, but they're not my ICP. I'm not trying to sell to another agency. So for that reason, it runs the risk of building in the wrong direction. So boosted content is great and sponsored content is great, so long as the content itself is definitely adding value to your ICP. If it's just a nice thing that your friend or your investor has said about you, probably not, because it builds reach in the wrong direction.
Okay, great. That's a useful information. And then in this whole flywheel that you just described, I wanted to ask, where's the space for direct messages? And if there is a space for it at all, or are we passively waiting for people to come in?
Sure. So one really cool thing about Heyreach in particular, and I'm sure the others do this as well, but I've only ever used Heyreach. So it has the cap of 25 connections per day and 40 messages per day. But if you were to go outside of that yourself, so for instance, I've sent 25 connections today, I manually send a 26th one. That's unlikely to flag as spam. But on the flip side is if you get ahead of the curve with Heyreach, let's say for instance, 8 o'clock in the morning, I send 5 connection requests. Heyreach that day will only send 20. So for that reason, you're not risking those limits, if that makes sense. Which I think is really important because obviously with LinkedIn in 2026, a lot of people are leveraging it for B2B sales and B2B marketing. I get the sense that they are on the lookout for teams who are trying to breach policy. With your point about the DM data is that what you can do is still do that manual outreach, still do that manual DM. A bit like I've done with prospects literally over the last week. If you come across content that is highly specific to your territory, but at the same time, it's really important to make sure that that lead isn't in the list that you're already running. Because if they are, you send that manual message, they won't get the follow-ups, they won't get the curated stuff that you've spent so long putting together, right? So there's a place for it, but there's a couple of things that you have to check beforehand. Things like they're not already existing in the campaign, and making sure that you are still abiding within those limits, because that's a surefire way to get your account flagged very quickly.
And during your career, have any accounts been flagged, Kieran, or that never happened?
Never happened. The only time that I had a warning from LinkedIn, it was for my own account, was because I was scraping too much data from it effectively. I was scraping en masse using something called Firecrawl. You might have come across it, and they sent me an email and said, you can't do that. This is your effectively a formal warning. And I was like, right, okay, noted. I will never do that again. Because if I lost my LinkedIn account, half the business would be going out the window.
Great. Oh, I have a few follow-up questions on content side of things, because I see you consistently post on your LinkedIn, and a lot of people struggle with that. And what's more, you also post on behalf of your clients, like you create those social media posts. So question number one is, you know those founders for like a week to 3, it's not a long time, and then you become them on social media. So the question is, how do you do that? And then second question is, how do you find writing content for yourself? How do you manage being consistent?
Cool. So first one, in the very early stage, what I do with the client is the first week is onboard them with what I would call a tone of voice. So some founders have a tone of voice document, some don't. I think in the age of AI, it's really important to have a tone of voice document. And by that, I mean a document whereby you talk about exactly how you want to come across as a founder, what that personality looks like, so that every time somebody interacts with you online, they know what kind of person to expect. At the earliest possible stage, we adopt that tone of voice document and put that into the system to make sure that it sounds and feels like the founder. So that's the first part of it. The other part of it is it's not a total DFY done for you service, in the sense that I still require the input from the founder around the ICP. AI can do a great job. Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, pick your favorite character, right? They can all produce good content to an extent, but the human manual intervention bit, which is curating it specifically for the ICP, grounding it in narrative and operative pain, is the really important bit. So there's two sides to it. It's the tone of voice, but also working directly with the founder to know the pains around the ICP. And from there, you can kind of gauge, based on traction of content, based on the message that's going out, exactly what type of content is resonating. You usually get a good feel for that after about week 3 or 4, where you can then double down on that. And then to your second question, Arthur, about how I produce content for myself, it's the same premise that I use for myself as I do for clients. The way I do this is I rotate 5 content pillars at a time. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of a content pillar, what a content pillar effectively is a category of content. And I rotate 5 different styles through those content pillars. So I'll give you an example of the content pillar I'm working through at the moment with my content that is currently going out, is around why hyper automation is killing B2B founder sales. Because I firmly believe that too much automation at the early stage is just a recipe for disaster. So lots of my content now, especially over the last couple of weeks, has been around why hyper automation isn't necessarily a good thing. And the styles that I rotate through that are pain. So pain is to call out your prospects' pains and problems better than they can themselves, ideally. Proof. So proof content is to showcase that you are the one to solve those problems, usually in the form of case studies or testimonials. Behind the scenes content. So that's content to show that under the hood look at how things are done internally. You've shown that you can solve the problems. Behind the scenes content is your opportunity to show exactly how that's done. Insight content. So that's effectively an opinion piece on a given topic in your industry niche. And obviously, if I was to look at my medtech clients at the moment, AI is a hot topic in healthcare, as I'm sure you can imagine. Lots of the insight content we produce for that client is around the use of AI. And then finally, decision support content. So that type of content is designed to add value to their internal decision-making process, whether they choose to engage with you or not. The idea here is to add value regardless of whether they know you. So that they can, these are the vendors you should consider. This is why you should be considering them. These are the regulations that you might be bit with if things go wrong, those kinds of things. Because it's not necessarily about just being a walking, talking advert for your product or service. It's about adding value to your audience and implicitly building trust at scale by doing so. And that's the framework that I tend to follow in order to do that.
Great. That's great insight, Kieran. Thank you for that. I'll need to process that and maybe extract a transcript and share it with everyone. So I have a few follow-up questions heading towards the last 15 minutes, Kieran,
Sure.
and these are around the tools and costs. So if you were to speak to SaaS founders going from zero or having early revenue, what's the minimal viable go-to-market stack, and what does it cost more or less per month?
Great question. So it's a really tough one, actually, because obviously I'm in the luxury position now where I can look at tools and think that's great. But the early stage, I may not have done that. So LinkedIn, of course, it's free to use for one, right? So as an absolute minimum, LinkedIn actually bread and butter for organic reach, for outreach, etc. I think you can make the most of Heyreach to do DMs without necessarily needing Sales Navigator. So I spoke to a founder recently who is using the search feature within LinkedIn. So, you can search for a name or a job title or whatever it is. So rather than using Sales Navigator to scrape data, they're just using the search bar within LinkedIn and then scraping that data and putting that into Heyreach. So that's a long-winded way of saying you don't necessarily need Sales Navigator to get off the ground with outreach, but I would definitely encourage something like Heyreach. So Heyreach is, I think, $70 a month for a seat. There are others that exist. You've got Pros, you've got EasyGens, in other words. There's lots of different sequences that exist, and they all broadly are interchangeable. The reason I chose Heyreach was mainly for the resources than anything else. So a LinkedIn automation tool, I think, would be my recommendation. Content, you don't necessarily need anything paid. You can do it mostly with AI and Canva. So all graphic design that I do is all within Canva. I did have Figma for a little bit, but I couldn't be bothered with the learning curve, if I'm being totally honest. So I stuck with Canva, but I have got friends who use Figma and they recommend that as well. And I keep telling them I'll convert one day, but just not today. So LinkedIn, Canva, an automated outreach tool of your choice, really. And I think for the earliest stage, in terms of getting off the ground, I think that's pretty much all you need. At the point in time where you think you need to layer in more sophistication, or say you begin to generate revenue and you're confident that you can scale it to multiple personas or whatever that might be, then it maybe look at things like databases. So Sales Navigator, Apollo, Clay, Freckle, there's lots that exist. But as a very foundation and a fundamental to work off, LinkedIn, Canva, and some kind of automated outreach tool, I think it's pretty much all you need.
Great. And from more advanced tools, there are platforms like Clay that cost significant amounts. When do you think is the right time to go towards this type of platforms?
Good question. So I get this question probably on a daily basis.
Okay.
And I think it's a good thing, because I think it goes to show that it's kind of a sign of the times around hyper automation and why it's good but equally bad at the same time. So my recommendation with tools like Clay are that if you know you have product market fit, or you're very, very close to it, at least, where you can say, we spin up this content, we spin up this outreach, we put these ads out and go to these events, and it generates X amount of leads. And you can be quite firm on that. Maybe you're firm on your customer acquisition costs or your lifetime value costs, whatever that might be. Once you have that data and you know you're close to product market fit, then it makes sense to layer in these additional platforms. But I think at the early stage, running things like massive signal enrichment lists and lots of different integrations, it's almost over complexity for the sake of it. That said, the likes of Clay, Freckle, others, they are incredibly powerful tools used in the right way. But I think at the early stage, from 0 to 1, you probably don't need it. I would say Clay is more of a 5 to 10 type play. 0 to 5, you can get away with kind of scrappy bits and different segmented tools. I think when you get to close to product market fit, that's the point where you can look at more sophistication, the likes of Clay, etc.
And I have one question that came to me through another conversation where people had a bit of a fear of using their main LinkedIn accounts for the outreach because it's like a huge risk that something might go wrong. And if your whole business relies on your founder account, it's a huge risk. Do you have any experience with buying LinkedIn accounts or renting LinkedIn accounts? Because there are like people doing it. I've never experienced that myself, so it's hard to tell. I'm not sure if that's been like in your world.
No, I've never done it myself. I've never had a client that's wanted to. I had a friend who just before Christmas bought about 20 different LinkedIn accounts to run it for a huge volume play for a client. And the general takeaway when I last caught up with him, which was at the end of January, was that because it feels like a bot a lot of the time, the results just don't make sense. So effectively, there's no ROI. So I've never experienced it myself, but I do know it exists. But I don't know about you, Arthur, but every time that I log onto LinkedIn, you can almost spot the bots immediately.
Yeah.
And I don't think that does very well for your kind of implicit trust at scale if your brand looks and feels like a robot. Because fundamentally, we know AI exists, automation's great, but on a human level, people still buy from people. And I think the moment you feel as though you're being sold to by a bot, it just scares people away. So, but I've not had that experience, but I know people who have. And it's not been positive from the stories I've heard.
Okay, it's great to know. Thanks, Kieran. I have 2 follow-up questions on tools and costs. And one is LinkedIn ads minimal viable budget. Like what's realistic budget for a B2B SaaS, like going live with campaigns?
Sure. So I think the good thing is with LinkedIn is if you follow the small list methodology, you won't burn too much cash too quickly. If you try to advertise to a large sample size of say 100,000 people, you will burn through cash very, very quickly. Generally with clients, I recommend between £5 and £20 a day. I'm not sure what the conversion rate would be in euros or dollars, but between £5 and £20 per day, depending on the list size. And that tends to run around 2 to 3 weeks. I can't do the maths that quickly, but it's not a massive amount of ad spend, which is always surprising when I talk about it, because I think that the default assumption is you have to run lots of ads at lots of volume with big budgets. And that's not necessarily the case on LinkedIn if the list that you're targeting is super dialed into your ICP. So if I know that I have 1,000 artists in the room, for instance, and I want to advertise to 1,000 of you, even if 60% of that list gets matched via ads, I know I'm still advertising to 600 of you. And therefore the budget will be a lot cheaper as a result. Whereas if I was to try and you do that on a firmographic basis, i.e. use LinkedIn's native filtering, that becomes very expensive very quickly because lots of people fall into those firmographic filters. So it's about kind of engineering the list, if you like, as well as engineering the outreach system, the content system. Ads have this perception that they need to be expensive to work, and in my experience, they don't. As long as you can do it in a coordinated, strategic way, you can do it pretty cheaply.
Great. That's great insight. And a follow-up question to that, it's about a realistic timeline from start of the campaign to the moment when you get your first meetings booked, your experience, how did it play out?
Sure. So generally around week 4, you are probably confident that you've at least got some early discovery conversations coming, or you're confident on what message is resonating. So what I mean by that is the first 3 weeks almost treat as the content experiment phase to figure out what is resonating with the target audience. By week 4 or 5, you have a good idea of what has worked because you've probably produced between 15 and 20 pieces of content in that time. By that point, you've got enough data, you've got enough of a sample size to say this is currently working. So around week 4, genuinely, and as time goes on, you can imagine that you get more dialed in with that message. That message market fit becomes a lot clearer. And typically by the end of those 12-week engagements that I run with clients, for instance, we can say, right, we're going to run this content pillar, we're going to run these types of posts because it's producing these amount of leads. To go back to my medtech example, I've been working with these guys since October, and we ran 2 12-week campaigns. The first 12-week campaign was around 20 to 30 meetings. this campaign that we've run, which finished recently, was around 80 meetings. Exactly the same premise, exactly the same engagement style, but we got closer to message market fit this time around, which made it easier to book those meetings. So the short answer is around 4 weeks, but expect it to get better as time goes on, and you compound your learnings over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And then probably two closing questions, Kieran. So one, LinkedIn is just like a one part of a lead gen system, visibility system. And there are like different platforms, like some of them might be webinars, might be events. And there's a lot of data across multiple platforms. I wondered if you get involved in like somehow integrating the data from LinkedIn outreach and ad campaigns into a bigger picture of how the company kind of tracks their performance around lead gen.
Yes
And if
and
you
no.
do, how would you even go about it?
Yes and no. So usually, so I've got a freelancer that I work with who he classes himself as the RevOps guy, effectively. So most of my clients that want that kind of infrastructure in place, I'll work with him to do the most part of that. So I kind of feed in the data, if that makes sense. He does the coordination. So I'm not going to try and sit here and pretend that I know exactly how to coordinate all those systems. He tells me what I need to give him. He puts it together. But I'll give you a context for a client that I'm working with at the moment. I think what you're talking about there, Arthur, is that I guess lots of these platforms exist in silos, right? They don't necessarily pass through data together, which makes it really tough to have that single pane of view, single pane glass view of the outreach campaigns. So a client I'm working with at the moment, what we've basically done is they had an email system in place, they had a cold call system in place, and they weren't running anything at all. And they had tools like Clay and HubSpot and a couple of others, but they were all very much siloed. So often you can get really complex with this and look at things like APIs and bring in something like Apify, for instance, and to connect the back end together. But sometimes it could be something on a much more simple basis that you just need effectively a one tool does it all stack for you. So what we did instead, rather than do that overhaul back end route with the APIs and stuff, we recommended that they leverage something like Lemlist or Salesforce, which basically is everything they had already, but condensed into a single platform. Because it simplified it for the team. It made sure that there was ownership for clear work streams. So there's two ways to do it, really. You can go the back end, which is implementing the APIs and making sure everything's connected and integrated, which takes a lot of time. And that's where I suppose the go-to-market engineer term has come from, is to engineer all of those platforms together. But the flip side of that is some teams don't necessarily need that complexity. So bringing in a tool like Salesforce or Lemlist, a multi-platform tool that can coordinate all of the above, but without the complexity, often that's needed too. So it very much depends on the use case. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, I guess, is what I'm trying to say here.
Great, thanks, Kieran. That all makes sense. Yeah, so pretty much, organizations, businesses, startups, they need to look for like a RevOps person to like get things together if they want to have a kind of visibility across multiple platforms.
I think, especially when you layer in sophistication. If you're doing it with just LinkedIn, for instance, or just email campaigns, it can become quite simple to track that through the tools that you're using. But to bring them all together, yes, I think RevOps is especially as you become a more mature company, having a RevOps person is definitely recommended because it just makes it so much easier to have that single pane view of all your data coming in and out.
Brilliant. And what I wanted to finish off, Kieran, since we still have half an hour, I hope you're okay with that.
Yeah, sure.
And I have like a few scenarios here. And those scenarios are typical types of businesses. Let me just bring that. So I have 5 scenarios here. One is about health tech SaaS doing around 600K. Another one is about someone posting consistently for 6 months. But I'll go with the scenario 3. And you tell me your take on that. So we are a 2-person DevTools startup, pre-revenue. We can't afford a fractional go-to-market partner yet. What's the DIY version of what you do? What can we build ourselves for around 500 a month?
Oh, great question. 500 a month. Okay, cool. So what you can implement the same system as what I'm describing here. So let's take a 12-week process. So we go month 1, month 2, month 3. Month 1, I would recommend getting very, very specific with your ICP as soon as you possibly can, down to the nitty-gritty detail. That is what keeps them up at night. What are they banging their head on the laptop about today, right? It's not just the problem broadly that you solve, it's what is really causing them a headache. So getting really specific on your ICP. Breaking that ICP then into micro segments, whether that's based on a vertical, headcount, lots of different things. There's lots of work that goes into that, but segmenting them as best you can so that the message that you do send is highly contextual, highly specific, and not just a spray and pray tactic. So that would be my first recommendation, is get really clear on your customer why. After about week 2 in that process, then I would say to start leveraging LinkedIn content heavily and lean into the process that I described earlier. So around 5 content pillars, roughly. So those categories of content that your customers will care about. Rotate those 5 styles that I mentioned earlier through those categories. And you can lean on AI to do this. For instance, if I talk about the health tech example again as earlier, only because I'm working with these guys today, we talk about things like when I spoke to a medical director last Thursday, he said X, Y, Z. And you can apply that same narrative format to pretty much any B2B context. So around week 3 or 4, start leveraging LinkedIn content heavily, organically. Don't look at ads at the moment. From there, if you've got 2 founders, I would recommend both of you owning kind of separate content pillars and talking around those specific topics. Around week 5 or 6 then, so that's after roughly 4 weeks of content, that's when I would encourage you to start reaching out. And the reason I say it around that point is because by that point, week 5 or 6 in the campaign, you've got enough valuable content within your personal profile so that by the time somebody lands on your profile, they understand what value you add, why you've reached out, and why they should care about having that conversation with you. And you can run, that takes about, assuming you run 600 prospects, that'll take about a month to run. So that's another 4 weeks. And on top of that, you can iterate on the content at the same time. So figuring out what is resonating with your audience, getting in those early meetings and discussions to bounce those ideas off. And the most important thing that I would recommend with those early meetings is any objections or anything that feels a little bit uncomfortable about what your prospect is saying, document all of that and turn it into content. Because if your prospects are already feeling those pains and they're willing to say that to you on a call, you can guarantee that your other prospects who are on LinkedIn are also going to feel that same pain. So having that documented and turning it into content can be just as powerful. So that takes you to around week 10, 11. At that point in time, you can look at whether it's worth scaling this to ads. If you know that your content is producing a certain amount of leads, or you can guarantee that it's going to get X amount of traction, and your outreach messages are converting into meetings, by that point in time, it would make sense to turn on ads and boost the posts that are already performing well. Because the key detail with LinkedIn is, as I said earlier, it's not a pay-to-win platform. If you're not already performing well organically, you will not perform well paid. It's as simple as that. Whereas with Meta, Google, pretty much any other ad platform, the more money you put into it, the more likely you are to get your eyeballs on the content, right? LinkedIn doesn't work in that way. So that's why I always say to prove the 2 concept first with content and outreach, then scale to ads. And you could do that in a 12-week process. If it doesn't make sense to switch on ads after 12 weeks, that is absolutely fine. You go again and you restart the process with defining the ICP really specifically, getting really kind of granular with how you break those down, and repeating the same content outreach approach. For £500 a month, you can do that with Heyreach. That will cover 2 seats on Heyreach. That will cover your Sales Navigator database, as well as Canva Pro if you really need it. So, but yes, I think that's how I would run it if I was on that budget.
That's a great advice. Kieran, just one last question on those 2 developers. Would you recommend to run ads, let's say this week 12, any other type of ads than boosted posts?
No, not typically. So I haven't run a data capture ad or any other format for that matter since probably March last year. And the reason for that is when people feel as though they're being sold to, they're kind of turned off by it, right? We all have that human nature where if we feel as though someone's pushing something towards us, we don't want to see it. Whereas if you're boosting content and boosting sponsoring posts, often that's because the content itself is already good because it's performed well organically. So it never feels like a sell. It never feels like you're trying to start a sales conversation. It just feels like you're trying to add value via content. So for that reason, I never recommend doing any other ad format than boosting posts. And also it's the cheapest. So it's probably the most valuable while also costing the least, especially if you manufacture the list in a way that is smart rather than having that big spray and pray tactic. So it's a fine balance to strike. And it feels a little bit, I think with LinkedIn ads, there's so much you can do. It almost feels as though, why aren't you leveraging everything else? But of all the campaigns I've run in the last 18 months, the best performing campaigns time and time again are the ones that only rely on sponsored or boosted posts.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's coincidence, really.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kieran. And the last closing question, is there anything else you'd like to share with people listening to shorts or long form that I might have not asked you yet about? Something that could be really important for those SaaS businesses to get more traction, more leads, grow faster? Like what your recommendation would be?
Absolutely. So it sounds, every time I say this to a client, it sounds bizarre, right? But be a human. And I know in the age of AI, that is probably frowned upon. But I think if you look at the high performing content on LinkedIn consistently, yes, you see the regurgitated AI nonsense that they've replaced the marketing team within 500K marketing team in 2 weeks or whatever it is. I'm not talking about that stuff, right? I'm talking about being human to the point where you have a personality. If you look at my content on LinkedIn, for instance, I am quite close to the bone in some of the stuff I say. I'm not afraid to offend people. I'll quite often call out industry incumbents, and I think that plays into my brand because my personality is I'm going to challenge things, and I think that's absolutely fine. So I think if you're an early stage founder, the temptation is to be this ultimate professional where you need to be super rigid all of the time and kind of show up in a suit and in a tuxedo, whatever it is, right? But the reality is people buy from people. And the more you feel like a person and as a personality and something that they can kind of interact with on the other side of the screen, that's going to serve you so much better than any rigidity or kind of formal work that the lots of B2B founders fall into at the earliest stage. So be a bit cheeky, be a bit human, be funny, have a personality, be anything but corporate and be anything but boring. Because in the startup world, that will not cut through the noise. And fundamentally, that is what you're trying to do at the earliest stage. And without having that personality to go with it, you're going to find it very, very hard to cut through that noise.
Great. Thank you, Kieran. Thank you for that. And thank you for your time today. I think that's all for now. We have a few listeners with us who stayed throughout this call. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And we're going to upload this video to the community and it's going to stay here on YouTube. So you can always rewatch, re-listen. And yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you, Arthur. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Great.